Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to the second of the IPI's Lunch and Learn CPD on marine spatial planning. As I mentioned last week, we have one speaker today. Our second speaker was no longer able to present. So because of that, our talk will go on for a little bit longer. There'll be time for a Q&A and afterwards, and we aim to finish up at 2 o'clock. Once again, if you have a question, pop it into the chat box. And thank you very much, everybody, for the feedback that we received last week. And we'd be very appreciative if you would give us feedback again this week. Our speaker today is Ali Robinson, and she will give us an introduction to seabed characterization. And just a reminder that next week we have two speakers, and they are Rory O'Leary, who's the head of policy and consenting with MARA, and Conor McCabe, the head of the International and Offshore Energy Division with DEC. But Ali, our speaker today, has a very, very valuable skill set because Ali is a planner with a marine geology background. She has over 12 years experience working in the public and the private sectors, including a technical lead and contributor on the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And subsequently, Ali worked on two European marine geological and geophysical integration projects with the GSI in ModNet and GOCs. Ali is currently the Development Management Planning Lead with Ishka Erin. She's a member of the IPI, and Ali is also a member of the Marine Spatial Planning Committee. So Ali, over to you.
Thank you very much, Terry. I'll just share my screen. So welcome everyone to today's session, and it's great. I just want to make sure everyone can see that. Yeah. So welcome to today's session, and it's great to see so many people joining. And we're going to look at something a little bit different today, which is seabed characterization. It's an area that's often overlooked at optioneering or early conceptualization of projects, and it's an area I think as planners and planning practice we need to be aware of. Just thanks for the intro there, Terry, but my main interests in life are sailing, geology and marine planning. And I've been very lucky to spend time offshore and see the ocean in all its kind of guises. And I think that as an island nation, over the last few years, we're becoming more and more, we're reawakening to the importance of the ocean in our lives. And on that point, if we just look at the extents of our sea areas on this image, Ireland is unique in Europe in terms of the unique challenges and unique opportunities it faces in terms of marine spatial planning. So today's session, as I say, it's a primer on seabed characterization. It's not an in-depth look, and seabed characterization is typically focusing on depth profile, morphology, and substrate. And it would be remiss of any session on seabed characterization not to discuss delineations. And before that, I think it would be useful to do a preamble, a short preamble through the marine directives to set the context for today's discussion. So first of all, seabed characterization, and why is it relevant to planners? And I'm sure many people are considering that. It is critical to understand the seabed in terms of the location of certain ore technologies. Seabed substrate determines the habitats, the floral and faunal benthic communities, and ergo designations, fish populations and fish migrations and marine species. It underpins constraint mapping and site selection for exploration and licensing and authorizations and many other activities. And many on the call will have either previously or currently or into the future will have decisions to make as planners in these areas. So a holistic understanding of the seabed, it really gives us an idea as to why things are where they are and informs many decisions. Just go down. So, before we get into the nuts and bolts, it's very easy on a day like today. We look out to sea and it's wet and it's miserable and it can look like a very grey planar surface. But in actual fact, it's an incredibly complex, dynamic, multidimensional environment. And we talk about dimensions in measures, 3D and 4D. So the marine environment is X and Y, which as planners we're all very familiar with. Spatial, it's our lats and longs, meridians and parallels, or our eastings and our northings. Z is our depth profile, and T is time. So again, GIS elements in planning, it's talking about the spatio-temporal dimensions of the ocean. Now, I don't know about anyone else on the call, I'm very comfortable in the 3D marine environment. I've yet to experience the 4D environment. So if anyone has, put their hand up afterwards and tell us about it. So I think the key thing from this image is that the marine ocean, in all its complexity and wonder and multidimensionalism, it is an ecosystem, and which is a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment, of which humans could be considered an element. Ireland has significant responsibilities in terms of marine spatial planning, and we have jurisdictional responsibilities for an area over 500,000 square or almost 500,000 square kilometres. So just bear in mind as we go through the discussion today, the multidimensional element of the ocean, and that it is in fact an ecosystem. So very brief preamble through the marine directives. There are two main directives, European directives for the marine, and they are the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive. And the EU directives, as planners, we have to deal with a raft of them every single day, from the Habitats Directive, the Nitrates, Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, EIA, SEA, Water Framework Directive. So what we find is that they all segue with each other. And in particular, the marine directives, the European marine directives, segue with the habitats, in particular, SEA and EIA. So just something to bear in mind. So each member state has a responsibility to meet the obligations of these directives and to transpose elements of them into our own state law. So just very quickly to have a look then at the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Again, for context, at its core are three pillars: assessment, determination of good environmental status within the marine environment, and then the setting of targets, that environmental targets that allow us to monitor the status within our marine environments. And I've listed the 11 descriptors across from there. And I worked for a number of years on the MSFD, and it was probably the first comprehensive coming together of over 120 stakeholders and knowledge gathering exercise in the marine environment for Ireland, and set the baseline really and a precursor to the evolution and the roadmap to marine spatial planning in Ireland. So the next one then, I just mentioned briefly, the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive. And the key point from this is that this directive requires member states to apply an ecosystems approach to marine spatial planning. And an ecosystems approach is encapsulates the evaluation of cumulative effects, the monitoring of competing interests, and the appropriate management of activities in our marine area. And, you know, same as EIA, etc., it shall be based on the best scientific knowledge. And we have a huge amount of knowledge. We will always need more, but we have a lot of knowledge of our marine areas, despite the vastness of those areas. So if you take nothing else out of today's session, there are two terms that I would say take out of it, is the application of the ecosystem-based approach to MSP, and that presupposes a holistic perspective of our marine environment. And again, I'll keep coming back to those two terms, a holistic perspective of our marine environment. So just move on then to, so just want to get this working. So before we go into delineations, we're just zooming down here into a 3D model and off our offshore southwest of Ireland. And as planners, we're predominantly preoccupied with the terrestrial. But as I said, you know, there is a terrestrial, albeit submerged, landscape off our coasts. It's an incredible morphological and geological and living landscape with valleys and, you know, canyons, mountains. We've got cliffs higher than anywhere above land on the entire planet, just off our coasts. And the morphology and substrate and water depth profiles support everything above the seabed. We have beautiful vast plains, and we're just flying through the Rockall Trough here now, and we're going to zoom back out into the mid-Atlantic ridge off the Hatton Banks, looking back toward Ireland. So it's just to remember, our landscape doesn't end at the foreshore, it continues out considerably into the offshore area. So, as I said, it would be remiss not to give a very quick outline of our baselines, and I would imagine everyone on the call is familiar with these, but we'll go through them. They are very important. So, maritime boundaries delineate, I suppose, a member state's jurisdictional rights over its sea areas. But as Gaudi said, there's no straight lines in nature, and as a result, historically, boundaries can become and have become inherently political. So the question here is, do boundaries facilitate a holistic perspective and support an ecosystems-based approach to MSP? I'll just leave that with you. So if we look here, these are the navy line here. This is our baselines. They are straight baselines measured from our headlands to the low water mark of our islands. And all waters landward of these straight lines are referred to as Ireland's internal waters. And I would suspect that as planners, much of our interactions with the marine seabed and the marine are on the coastal side, development management on coasts and licensing, etc., within the remit or the region of the internal waters. Interestingly, in the old days, they had a much more interesting way of defining these. They would fire a cannon from the coast, and wherever the cannonball landed, that was the delineation of your internal water. Ireland exercises full sovereign rights in these waters. So the next one here is this line here. It is a straight line 12 nautical miles out from our internal baseline, and this delineates our territorial waters. And civilian ships may pass over the seabed, through the waters, and obviously aircraft in the airs of our territorial waters, subject to prior permission. A kind of a comfort blanket or an extra layer of security is a further extension out of 12 nautical miles to the contiguous zone. And interestingly, sovereign laws, our jurisdictional rights apply here to any ship that has left our territorial waters or is intending to come into our territorial waters. And then everyone will be familiar with this. It's our continental shelf exclusive economic zone. And we will talk about aspects of that in a moment. And within this, Ireland exercises its rights on, exploration, fisheries, emigration, taxation, pollution, all of our rights. And it is designated as exclusive rights because it encompasses a significant portion of our continental shelf. It's otherwise known as our continental shelf designation. A further designation is critically important for potential future claims being made by Ireland is the extended shelf designation. And in this, we are encompassing the Hatton Banks, the Porcupine Bight areas. This is the Porcupine Bight here, and further down Zone 3 areas off our southwest shores. And at the moment, Ireland has territorial claims in, and we'll talk through them. So Zone A is, there is a claim into the UNCLOS, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and Ireland has exercised rights over this area through these different orders, continental shelf orders for each of these three zones. Zone A is currently contested by the Faroe Islands and Iceland and Ireland. Zone B is uncontested, and Zone C is contested by the Fishew states, which is France, Ireland, Spain, and the UK. So the UNCLOS law of the sea provides for a very prescriptive means whereby a member state may evidence rights to an extended continental shelf. And in the case of Zone B, those rights have been accepted, and in law now, this zone here is now it is a part of our economic exclusive zone. It equates to about 40,000 square kilometres, so significant in terms of marine spatial planning. The equation is called the Gardner equation, and I won't go into it, but you can look it up. And what it does is it looks at an indice of the depth of your sediment materials continuously extending from your existing shelf within a percentage of the distance to the shelf. And Ireland has justified claims to extend out to that area, to encapsulate these areas into our economic exclusive zone. So you can see the significance to marine spatial planning if that were to happen. So just to depth profiles then. So depth profile probably is one of the first methods of characterizing the seabed. And again, as planners, why is this important to us as planners? Depth very often will be one of the key, let's say, constraints in constraint mapping, why offshore technologies are located where they are. That's just one example. And as we go through this, consider, do we have lots of space in our marine environment? It may look like we have lots of space, but for certain technologies reliant on shallow waters, we may not. And again, fixed technologies prefer shallow waters of less than 60, ideally 50 meters. Floating, excuse me, technologies are more suited to up to 800 meters depth. So the light blue line here is the 50-meter contour around our coasts, and it coincides and correlates very well to our internal waters. Again, the inference here is that many of our coastal activities occur in shallow waters. If we lay on our 100-meter contour, we immediately see there's a direct correlation along our east coast here of shallow, more stable waters where we have a concentration of offshore renewables. So it's just to be mindful. We think we may have a lot of room, but perhaps we don't have as much room as we think. Moving out then to the 500-meter, and this is coming out to the continental shelf, the edge of the shelf here, and we have long plains before we hit that 500 meters, and I'll explain why that's important in a moment, down to 1,000 meters all the way along the foot of our shelf. And then it's incredible. We drop 2 kilometers down and then down 4 kilometers. So it's absolutely critical to understand the huge influences at play well before the ocean hits our shores. And if you look out here, these are our abyssal plains, the mid-Atlantic trough, 4 kilometer depth of water driven by gravity, the jet streams, and heating at the surface of the Earth at the equator. It means that these huge waters are absolutely charging toward Ireland's shores. And what happens? They hit an almost 3 kilometer high wall. All of the latent energy in that water is thrown up into huge, long ground swells. And these long ground swells travel over the flat areas, and these are predominantly flat, sandy, muddy sand areas. And they're called the fetch. And then they slam into our coastlines. So what we actually have is obviously one of the highest energy coastlines in the world, certainly in Europe, if not the world. And that has implication for our decision-making around the location of our technologies, both in terms of the release of the latent energy in wave and tidal energy technologies, but also the location of offshore wind energies. So just to note that offshore wind energies typically to date are fixed technologies requiring shallower depths. However, Norway have successfully commercialized a floating turbine, and they're looking at putting in 6 floating turbines, which demonstrates that we may be able to exploit the deeper waters for offshore wind technologies into the future. And I understand that is currently being looked at in Ireland to date. So just the next one then, more so around the species definitions. And again, as planners, an understanding of this within our coastal areas and offshore areas. If we were to do a profile or a depth gradient from the Aran Islands or Inishbofin right off our shelf down to the foot of the slope of the shelf and out to our abyssal waters, this is Inishbofin here or Kilronan in the Aran Islands. We come down 50 meters down to our 500, 3,000, and then right off into the mid-Atlantic. All of the waters and the open sea waters, all species that live in the open waters are referred to as pelagic. And then species that live on or above the seabed are bentopelagic or benthic. So bentopelagic live just above the seabed and benthic are on the seabed. And we will have, and I'm really looking forward to it, another session on the ecology within the marine environment. And these terms are very important. So morphology then, and this is my favorite, morphology describes the seabed shape of the features, the size and the configuration. And again, I'll bring it back to, why is this important as planners? Again, morphology, substrate, depth, they inform decisions. And morphology is particularly important around our coastlines in terms of designations, conservation objectives, habitat management, fisheries, a whole raft of sectors. But in the deep as well, it's very important. It informs sectorial activities. Not only does morphology inform sectorial activities, there is an obligation on the planning community and as planning practitioners to understand the impact of sectorial activities on the seabed. And seafloor integrity is a part of the National Marine Planning Framework and the MSFD directive to ensure that seafloor integrity is not impacted. So coming down then, we're going to just look very quickly at some of the banks, first of all, and there are sandbanks all around our east and northeast and southeast, but there's the four key banks are the Burford Bank, the Kish, the Codling, and the Arklow Bank. And I'm looking at these from the context of a morphological feature. And the reason why we have these banks on our east coast is because we have a shallow depositional environment, as we've already seen. It's quite stable in terms of, there aren't huge flushes of water coming through here because they're broken up by the fetch of Cornwall and southeast Ireland. The depositional regime is a result of multiple interglacial deposits going back as far as the Holocene, and this was when the Ice Age subsequent retreats and of Ice Age left these depositional the deposits of sands, fine sands, pebbles, coarse grains, and gravels. And what you have here on the east coast is a strong tidal regime of a north-south tidal regime predominantly. So I thought we'll have a look at one of these banks and just kind of maybe consider some of the interactions with the bank, and some of them arising from the bank and some of them independent of the bank. And the Burford Bank, it sits about 5 k's off Dublin Bay. It rises to within 5 meters of the surface of the water, and at its highest point, it's around 20 meters high. So we've Dún Laoghaire here, Howth, and we can see the linear feature there. So this image here is, there's Howth, Dún Laoghaire, Dalkey, and fantastic images here. The scouring of Dublin Port and the bank itself, and this is it blown up. And these are Infomar seabed images and very high resolution, and Infomar is absolutely critical stakeholder, their seabed mapping activities to supporting marine planning. And all of this information is available from them on their websites. But the tides come in from the north, south, they flush around, giving us these beautiful elongated structures. And this is kind of tidal scouring here. But I want to just consider the feature on its own. And then I was thinking, okay, what is it interacting with? So if we layer on some, but not all, this is not an exclusive list of interactions. These are the current interactions with the Burford Bank, and they're multi-agency engagement in terms of the management of these activities. And the first one very quickly is Dublin Port. The EPA granted a license last year for out to 2035 for the dumping of dredging spoils here from Dublin Port. And I would urge anyone to read the annual environmental report by the EPA on that activity. It's extremely interesting and comprehensive. And it gives us a view of how alternatives were considered, cumulative impacts considered, and also mitigations. And it's in the sources at the end of this. Interestingly, the bank itself has become, I don't want to use the term, but it's almost an overflow car park for marine traffic into Dublin Port. And anyone on the East Coast, you'll see the occurrence of, the cruise ships are frequently using this as an area to anchor. A lot of the cargo ships will anchor there. It's a stable area and safe place for anchorage. 3 here is the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, and they carried out the mammal monitoring program when the dumping at sea was occurring last year between October and December, and they recorded over 214 species sightings in that very brief time, which is incredible to think that high level of species sightings. Infomar, I mentioned already, critical stakeholders in seabed mapping. The Dublin Array, which is going down to the south of the Burford Bank, its cabling area it's been proposed as such. The Sea Fisheries Protection Authority, Bord Iascaigh Mhara, there are over 40 trawlers active in these areas in Dublin Bay, predominantly nets and dredges. Heritage, the RMS Leinster, sank off the Burford Bank. And incidentally, these banks have a very high incidence of historic shipwrecks. Then we have NPWS, key stakeholder in the area for the Rockabill and Dalkey SAC. And Dublin Bay is a UNESCO biosphere. And then finally, a report which is on the government's website, which looked at the potential of for future of aggregates off our east coast and our shores. So to be mindful of all of these activities currently happening, some of them have arisen because of the bank, some are there coincidental to the bank. And the question here is, has this arisen from, I suppose, fragmented, sectorally driven? And into the future, how will marine spatial planning impose an ecosystems approach to the management of these activities, or the evaluation of them, the cumulative impacts and the management of these activities? And that ecosystems approach has to be done through a holistic lens and the holistic perspective. So it's just to throw that out there. The morphology is very, very important to underpinning evidence-based and plan-led decisions around implementing an ecosystems approach. So there's the banks. So we'll move on then to the basins and troughs. So basins are circular depressions, troughs are elongated, and Ireland has kind of northeast, southwest geomorphic trending, and they kind of form a ring around here, the Porcupine Basin, extensive. And in these basins, they are predominantly, they are sedimentary, and you can have up to 7 to 10 kilometers depth of sediment deposition. So they're very important for authorizations and exploration, and areas that may be seen as being cost prohibitive now may not into the future. And we can't, they will always have to be considered as areas of potential exploration. And it's unlikely that they would fall off that agenda. We go out here to the banks and the Hatton Bank and the Hatton Basins, again, within our, proposed to be, and we have exercised certain rights in these areas for exploration and fishing. Continental shelf and the abyssal plain. So abyssal, it's a great word, but anything off the deep water, anything off the shelves into deep water are referred to as abyssal. A very important morphological feature in the sea environment, the marine environment, are seamounts. And again, probably not that well known. And again, we have the Antoine Dorme seamount and the Hebrides, which are on the edge of Ireland's just on the edge of Ireland's economic exclusive zone here. And these deep water habitats, they support unique ecosystems and a range of marine species. But what Scotland have done is they've managed to create a marine reserve here, but not to the exclusion of other sectorial activities. And I suppose the Rockhall Bank area and Hatton Banks have similar seamount features and supporting unique species, and currently have other sectorial activities in the area. So there are examples where there's multi-use of areas that can be managed to that effect. Layering on the actual rock and the hard geology, again, these are the intrusive bodies. They're predominantly volcanic bodies, and the faults. And anyone who's driven from Letterkenny to Donegal, that's the Barnesmore Gap. Our fault regime in Ireland, it predominantly is Caledonian orogeny. Again, it's east, northeast, southwest trending. And why is this important? What we have here off our southwest coast are these incredible incised underwater canyons. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about the Whithard Canyon. And I only became aware of the Whithard Canyon about 10 years ago. We were working in the Geological Survey, and we met with the French Navy and their hydrographic unit, and we were working on, merging digital elevation models here to try and understand this area of the coastline. And these are extensive canyon systems. And more recently, then, surveys are showing that they are very important carbon sinks in terms of the faunal communities. They are carbon transport corridors from shallower waters to offshore areas, deep water. They also, highways and byways of the ocean, they funnel sediments and key nutrients. And if we look at the Whithard Canyon, and this is there's a paper, it's referenced in the sources, very interesting. It's a magnificent area just off our southwest coast. And these are the kind of some of the corals and the habitats that it supports. But the worrying thing that was also reported in this in the report, and the survey was a remotely operated vehicle, was the high instance of marine plastics and litters. And some of these were from fishing activities, but the predominant of them were from, single-use plastics. And while it's not necessarily relevant to seabed characterization, the point here is that as planners and practitioners, we have to be sure that our coastal and shallow water activities and decisions and planning takes in and considers the seafloor integrity and water columns of our offshore areas, and that these offshore areas directly interact with our coast and shallow waters. And the second point, again, I come back, is to the ecosystems approach and the holistic view. We don't have boundaries that apply to these types of marine environments. So we have to have that holistic perspective in its totality. And I suppose very positively, very recently, the Whithard Canyon and the Porcupine Shelf, they have been designated as SACs. So just moving on then, just to finish on that, part of that ROV expedition discovered in one of the canyons, and they're very dark, they're very, very deep. You're almost at 4 kilometers, a mountain, a pinnacle over 1 kilometer high that wasn't known. And that's only been discovered in a couple of years ago. And what's fascinating is that just off our shores, there are areas of our seabed that are less mapped than the moon. And I think that's just something, it's really exciting, but it's also very worrying that the influences and the impacts are being evidenced already from, let's say, more coastal activities. And there are big challenges for us and marine spatial planning to mitigate those impacts. So substrate then, really, really important. As substrate, it's any substance that an organism lives and grows on, rock, biogenic, which is organic, sands, gravels, muds, clays, etc. And substrate informs the habitats that live on it. And it also informs, as I said earlier, site selection for exploration, fisheries. It's incredibly important to fisheries. And obviously substrate at any depth informs what lives above it and on it. So this is a kind of substrate map that we created for the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, initial reporting and baseline reporting, rocks and gravels, coarse sediments, which are fine sands, they're sands, coarse sands, gravels, etc. Moving out then to extensive areas of mud and muddy sands, sandy muds, which typically in the shallower waters support nephrop populations, and we'll have a look at the old nephrops now a little bit later on. And then lower bathyl sediments, and slightly less known here, although more recently the Infomar program has been taking a lot of grab samples along the foot of our slope. And lower bathyl can be described of, this is a description of one of those grab samples, clays, light grey, brown silty, sandy clay, green clay. And then again, similar type sediment with overlain by clays as we move out into the abyssal plain. It's worth noting that certain substrates support carbon storage, and if you look at the National Marine Planning Framework, there's a very good map on that point where we've extensive areas here out toward the Hatton Banks, the Rockwall Trough, and down across on our shelf supporting carbon stores. So it's beyond the scope of this session, and we will have another session on ecology. Habitats within ecosystems, they occur because of a factor of depth, morphology, and substrate, and particularly substrate and water. They're the two most important supporting these habitats. And just one reason as planners, certainly in the coastal areas, is how they inform and how designations occur and conservation objectives under the Habitats Directive. We look at one of these very quickly, the Kenmare SAC, and a beautiful SAC from a geological perspective, from a seabed characterization perspective. And when we think of SACs, we tend to think it's the biodiversity, the flora and fauna that exists there. But this particular SAC also includes two morphological features, which are the bays and inlets, and I suppose the morphology of the inlet, and the rock and reef, which support the faunal communities. So that's just important, I suppose, in terms of coastal management and coastal zone management. So very quickly then, we're going to move on to a very short case study, and the old nephrops. I think it's just a great term, and these are our nephrops norvegicus or norvegicus. Food for thought. Poor chaps there. I don't know if for the vegetarians out there, but I do enjoy prawns now and again. This is, I mentioned earlier in our substrate mapping, we know that prawns need to have sandy mud, not muddy sand, but sandy mud. And these are very specific substrate classifications. They're based on folk, UNIS classifications, and you can look those up, and I'm sure many people are already very familiar with them. But they also require kind of shallower, warmer marine environments and the right morphology. So again, we've got very flat areas here because our nephrops burrow down during the day and they come out at night. And we can see up here, this comes all the way down into Dublin Bay. You can just see there is an area there in Dublin Bay, off Galway and off Southwest Waters. Now, if we look, and there's a really interesting report, I've taken this from a report done by Trinity on the sustainability of nephrops, if one is want to read that. We overlay this then with our fishing intensity. And this isn't all, this is just one type of fishing intensity, which are bottom otter trawls. And the blue areas are high intensity, and they correlate directly with obviously our nephrop areas. And bottom otter trawls by their nature may not always be selective for that particular species, and whiting is an unavoidable bycatch of otter trawling for nephrops. And under the MSFD, Article 19 was, I suppose, the monitoring and the update on monitoring of our initial assessments on GES, stated that due to the intensity of fishing effort and its spatial extent, which is extensive, and this is just one type of fishing type, it is a significant pressure acting on Ireland's marine environment. So just to maybe consider this a little bit in the context of marine spatial planning, the GES, or the Good Environmental Descriptor, stated by the Marine Spatial Planning Directive and referenced in our National Marine Planning Framework, is that fishing mortality rate of populations of species is maintained at a level that can produce the maximum sustainable yield. So we know that nephrops are potentially in decline, but we have a descriptor target here to ensure that mortality rates ensure that they are not declining to the point that they can't produce maximum sustainable yield. The fisheries policy in the National Marine Planning Framework dictates that proposals that enhance the sustainable, this is just one, there are others, enhanced sustainability of fisheries should be supported. So that's very encouraging. But I suppose the question here is this a holistic approach? It certainly is going the right way. And within the remit of the descriptor, we have a target, we know what we're trying to get. How then do we apply the ecosystems approach and to ensuring the evaluation of the cumulative impacts, the monitoring of the competing interests, and the management of those activities? So just to finish on that, I suppose to conclude, seabed character informs decision-making, and it is beholden on all of us as planners and planning practitioners to be aware of the key concepts around seabed character, how to define them, the key terminologies. We have to take a holistic perspective and an ecosystems approach to our marine environment, and our coastal activities, they must be considered in the wider marine context, i.e. our deeper waters and our offshore environments. And again, those two terms I keep coming back to is a holistic perspective and the ecosystems approach to management of our marine waters. So I probably got that through that a little bit quicker, Terry, than I had anticipated, but I just wanted to say one major thank you to everyone on the call, but also to my colleagues in the Geological Survey. I spent many happy years there, and their involvement in Infomar and the Marine Institute for their incredible mapping that they're doing. And this data is available free to everyone who is interested in marine planning. And we are world leaders in marine mapping, and many geological surveys from around the world have looked to Ireland and the GSI and the Infomar programme to replicate our mapping programmes. And I would just like to thank my colleagues there, in particular Koen Verbruggen, for just some discussions I'd had prior to presenting this on seabed characterisation. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ali. A very clear and very comprehensive presentation. And can I say, some of the most beautiful imagery I think I've ever seen in a presentation. And it's very clear, I think, to everybody on this call that you have a vast knowledge of the marine environment. It's great, there's a wealth of knowledge in that presentation, and because it will be available afterwards on the IPI website because of the departmental funding to upgrade the website. We have a few questions, Ali. First of all, there's a question in wondering about who defines the boundary of the contested sea areas which Ireland seeks to claim. On the surface, they look arbitrary. Are they based on geology, where Ireland typically fish?